Alice Bennet had never been the type to seek out trouble, nor had she ever been one to invite herself into the business of others. For nearly 2 decades she had lived in the same pale blue 2-story house at the corner of Ashford Lane, a home she had inherited from her parents after they passed. The place was more than just a piece of property. It was a repository of her family's history, from the creak of the floorboards in the upstairs hallway to the narrow kitchen window that framed the old oak tree she had climbed as a girl. She kept the home well, investing steadily in its upkeep, not because she needed to impress the neighbors, but because she valued the feeling of living in a place that was wholly hers, unencumbered by unnecessary interference. Her latest project had been the most ambitious yet: a full overhaul of the plumbing system, from the ancient cast-iron pipes in the basement to a brand-new main line connecting the house to the city water supply. The work had been expensive, even exhausting at times, but when it was finished she felt an immense satisfaction, knowing that the water flowing through her taps was as clean and reliable as the work of her trusted plumber, Paul Anders, could make. Water was important to her not just for daily life, but for the sprawling back garden she had cultivated with uncommon care, a place where heirloom roses bloomed beside orderly rows of herbs and delicate perennials that had been started from seeds her parents once brought back from Europe. Every evening she would carry her watering can across the yard, tending to each plant with the same deliberate patience she brought to everything she valued. Her relationship with the rest of the neighborhood was polite, but distant. People came and went over the years, and while she exchanged pleasantries at the occasional block gathering or while collecting mail, she had little interest in cliques or gossip. That was partly why she had always been wary of Karen Doyle, the woman who lived 2 houses down and seemed to thrive on keeping tabs on everyone. Karen's hair was always styled as though for a magazine shoot. Her voice carried a sharpness even when she smiled, and her conversations had a habit of circling back to what she thought others ought to be doing. Alice, who preferred to manage her own affairs without input from self-appointed overseers, avoided anything more than the bare minimum of interaction. Karen's position as a member of the neighborhood council gave her a veneer of authority she wielded liberally, though rarely in ways that benefited anyone beyond her own circle of friends. That summer had been particularly dry, with the city issuing occasional advisories on water conservation, but Alice had stayed within all the posted limits. Her upgraded system meant she could water efficiently without waste, and she kept meticulous records of her usage just in case any question arose. The evenings had a certain stillness to them, the kind of quiet she appreciated after a day spent consulting for a regional accounting firm, work that required intense concentration and long hours. It was during one such calm evening, the sun dipping behind the rooftops and casting long shadows across her lawn, that Alice paused at the garden gate to take in the view of her neatly kept property. The house stood solid and unassuming, the garden lush despite the heat, and for a moment she felt a rare certainty that she had done everything right to keep her home exactly as it should be. She could not have known, as she turned the watering can toward the final row of roses, that within days that sense of control would be shattered. A disruption was coming, one that would strike at the most basic of her daily needs, and it would not come in the form of an accident or a simple misunderstanding. Instead, it would arrive through the deliberate actions of people who had no rightful say over her property, people willing to twist the trust between a homeowner and those she had relied upon for years. It would begin quietly, with something as small as a change in water pressure, but by the time she understood the full shape of what was happening, the problem would have already rooted itself deep in the politics and grudges that simmered beneath. The surface of her seemingly peaceful street. The first sign that something was wrong arrived on a Thursday morning in mid-July, a morning that began like countless others in Alice Bennet's orderly life. The sun was already bright against the pale curtains when she came downstairs, the air carrying the dry stillness that had become typical of the summer. She moved through her routine without thinking. Coffee brewing, toast in the toaster, the quiet shuffle of slippers on the kitchen floor, until she reached for the faucet to fill the kettle and was met with a sputtering hiss, a thin, erratic dribble of water, and then nothing at all. She stood there for a moment, hand on the handle, listening to the hollow sound in the pipes, certain it must be a temporary lapse in pressure. She turned the tap off and back on again, tried the cold and then the hot, moved to the sink in the laundry room, then to the upstairs bathroom, each attempt confirming the same thing. The water was gone. Her first thought was a city-side maintenance issue, perhaps a burst main or scheduled repairs she had somehow missed in the notices. It would not have been the first time the municipal water department shut things down for a few hours, and though inconvenient, it was the sort of inconvenience one simply adapted to. She stepped outside into the warm glare of the morning sun, crossed the short walkway to the fence and leaned over to call to her neighbor across the street, a genial retired man named Bill who often tended his lawn before the heat set in. "Do you have water?" she asked, trying to keep her tone casual, and Bill, looking slightly puzzled, assured her that yes, everything was fine on his side. A quick check with the couple next door yielded the same answer. Their taps were running just fine. The unease began to take shape in her chest as she realized this was not a neighborhood-wide problem. Whatever had happened was specific to her property. There was no visible flooding, no signs of digging or equipment in the street, nothing to suggest that work was underway. The logical next step was to contact Paul Anders, her plumber, who had installed the new main line only a few months before. Paul had been in the business for over 20 years, and while not given to excessive conversation, he was dependable and direct, the sort of tradesman who kept meticulous records and treated each job with care. He answered on the second ring, his voice a touch distracted, and when she explained the situation, there was a pause, long enough for her to hear the faint background noise of tools and voices. He agreed to come by within the hour, though he did not sound surprised, and that subtle lack of surprise left her with a faint, unsettled question she could not yet name. True to his word, Paul's white van pulled up 45 minutes later, the side panel emblazoned with his business name in faded blue lettering. He stepped out carrying a toolbox, his cap pulled low over his brow, and gave a nod in greeting before heading toward the street valve at the edge of her property. She followed at a short distance, noting that he did not bother to inspect the interior plumbing first. He crouched at the cast-iron cover embedded in the strip of grass between the sidewalk and the curb, pried it open with the practiced motion of someone who had done this hundreds of times, and peered inside. She could not see what he saw, but she noticed the stiffness in his posture, the way his shoulders shifted slightly as if he were weighing what to say. When he stood, he did not meet her eyes immediately. "The valve's been closed," he said at last, his tone careful. "Completely shut." She frowned, trying to process the information. "Closed? By who? I haven't had any work done since you finished the new line." He hesitated again, then exhaled through his nose in a way that suggested he was choosing his words. "Officially, I'm supposed to tell you it was part of a scheduled inspection," he said slowly, "but there's no city order for it. Someone from the neighborhood council put in a request through my office, said it was urgent and that they'd handle all the paperwork." Alice felt a sharp chill despite the sun beating down on her shoulders. "The council? Why would they have anything to do with my water line?" Paul shifted the toolbox from one hand to the other, glancing toward the rows of houses as though checking for unwanted eyes. "Look, I don't know the politics here," he said, voice lower now, "but the guy who called was insistent, said he was authorized. He also paid in cash up front for me to come out and do the shutoff. It's unusual, but when someone says they're representing a property authority, you don't think twice unless there's a reason to." She stood there, the information settling heavily. The neighborhood council had no jurisdiction over city water supply. She knew that much without even checking, and yet someone had convinced her own plumber to cut her off. "Can you open it back up?" she asked finally. He rubbed the back of his neck, clearly uncomfortable. "I can, but if there's already a report filed somewhere that it was shut down for inspection, it'll just get closed again, maybe by someone less careful about how they do it. I'm not saying it's right, but I've seen situations where a homeowner ends up in a loop until they pay whatever fee's being demanded." It was in that moment she began to understand that this was not a mistake and not a technical hiccup. It was deliberate. The morning's calm had been replaced by the thrum of a very different kind of problem, one that was not about fixing a pipe, but about understanding who had decided to interfere in her daily life, and why. Paul's expression, half apologetic and half resigned, told her he would not be the one to answer that question. "I'm sorry, Alice," he said quietly, "but you might want to start with the council office. Whoever's behind this, they're the ones who signed off on it." She watched as he replaced the cover over the valve, the metallic clink echoing faintly in the still air. The water in her house remained dry, the garden silent behind her, and for the first time since she had moved into the pale blue home on Ashford Lane, she felt the edge of something she had only ever heard about in other people's stories. The kind of conflict that starts small, just a closed valve and a missing stream of water, but carries with it the weight of control, leverage, and the quiet, calculated pressure to bend. She turned back toward her front steps with the uneasy knowledge that her next move would have to be deliberate, and that the opening play in whatever game this was had already been made by someone who believed she would fall in line without a fight. The council office was located in a converted bungalow on the far side of the neighborhood, a building that had once been a small law firm before it was purchased and renovated to suit its new purpose. Alice had never been inside before, having had no reason to involve herself in the minor disputes and procedural matters that seemed to occupy much of its agenda. She arrived late in the morning, the air already heavy with heat, and stepped into a reception area that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old paper. Behind a counter sat a young man in a pressed shirt, scrolling idly through something on his phone until she cleared her throat. His expression shifted into a mask of polite detachment as he set the device aside and asked how he could help her. When she explained that her water had been shut off and that she was told the request came from someone in this office, his brow lifted slightly, but the politeness did not waver. "One moment," he said, disappearing through a side door, leaving her to absorb the faint hum of the air conditioning and the muted voices drifting in from somewhere deeper in the building. When he returned, he was accompanied by none other than Karen Doyle, who entered with the confident sway of someone accustomed to presiding over other people's problems. Karen was dressed impeccably as always, her linen blazer a shade of cream that matched her pointed heels, her hair perfectly arranged despite the weather. "Alice," she said as though greeting an old friend, though the curl at the corner of her mouth carried a trace of satisfaction. "I hear you've had a little trouble with your water. Why don't we step into my office and sort it out?" Alice followed her into a narrow room with tall windows and a desk that seemed almost deliberately uncluttered, as if to convey efficiency. Karen gestured for her to sit, then took her place behind the desk, folding her hands on the surface. "Now," she began, "there's been some concern about infrastructure upkeep in certain parts of the neighborhood, and the council has been proactive in addressing potential issues before they become emergencies. Your property's main line was flagged during a review, and we decided it was best to shut it down until the matter could be resolved." Alice kept her voice steady. "Flagged by who? The city water department didn't mention anything. In fact, they have no record of an inspection order for my address." Karen's smile did not falter, but her eyes sharpened slightly. "Well, the city is often slow to update their records, and frankly, their processes can be cumbersome. The council has arrangements in place to handle certain things directly for the benefit of residents. It's faster, more efficient, and ensures that everyone does their part to maintain the quality of our community." There was an almost imperceptible pause before she continued, her tone softening in a way that was clearly meant to feel reassuring. "Of course, these things are always easier when residents participate in the maintenance program we've set up. A modest annual contribution covers inspections, minor repairs, and avoids situations like this one altogether. I think you'll find it's in your best interest." The words hung between them, smooth and practiced, but the underlying message was anything but subtle. Pay the contribution, or the shutoff would remain in place indefinitely. Alice leaned back slightly, letting the silence stretch long enough to register her refusal to be cornered. "I'll deal with the city directly," she said at last, rising from her chair. Karen's smile thinned almost imperceptibly. "That's certainly your choice," she replied, "though I can't promise they'll be as responsive as we are." The exchange ended there, but as Alice walked out into the glare of midday, she could feel Karen's gaze following her, as if measuring how far she could be pushed before bending. The afternoon brought a different kind of confirmation. When Alice returned home, she found an unmarked envelope resting on her front porch, its paper crisp and heavy, the flap sealed but not addressed. Inside was a single sheet of plain stationery with a short, neatly written note. "Payment ensures uninterrupted service. You have 72 hours." No signature, no contact details, just those 8 words and the lingering scent of a perfume she recognized from her meeting with Karen. The audacity of it struck her as much as the threat. It was not just about the water. It was about control, about establishing dominance under the guise of neighborhood stewardship. That evening, as the sun dipped below the rooftops, Alice stood at the edge of her garden, looking at the parched soil around her plants, the leaves beginning to curl from the heat. She considered calling Paul to reopen the valve, but his earlier warning echoed in her mind. It would likely be closed again, perhaps more aggressively next time. She thought about simply paying the contribution, but the thought curdled in her stomach. Giving in would mean opening the door to more of the same, each demand dressed up as a service or a protection, each intrusion justified by some opaque rule. Instead, she made a decision. The next morning, she would begin formal proceedings with the municipal water department to document the interference, not as a complaint to be shuffled through the slow bureaucracy, but as an official report of unauthorized tampering with a city-owned connection. She would not accuse anyone by name, not yet, but the record would be there, and with it the start of a paper trail that could not easily be dismissed or buried. It was a small step, but as she closed the blinds against the night, Alice understood that in conflicts like these, the first steps had to be careful and deliberate. Her opponent was not a burst pipe or a faulty valve, but a person who had decided she was a target. And people like that rarely acted alone. The morning after Alice filed her report with the municipal water department, she awoke earlier than usual, her mind already rehearsing the day ahead. She had been told by the clerk on the phone that an inspector would be assigned to her case, though there was no promise of when that person might arrive. The city moved at its own pace, and she had no illusions about being placed at the top of any priority list. Yet there was a faint sense of relief in knowing the matter was now on official record. She spent the first hours of the day in the garden, using the water she had stored in a pair of heavy rain barrels to tend to her most fragile plants, knowing she could not sustain them this way indefinitely. The air was dry and sharp, carrying the faint scent of dust from the street, and she could hear the distant hum of lawnmowers and sprinklers from houses that had no trouble with their water supply. By late morning, a white utility truck rolled slowly down Ashford Lane, its side marked with the seal of the city water department. It stopped in front of her house, and a man in a navy shirt with the department's insignia stepped out, carrying a clipboard under one arm. He introduced himself as Marcus Ray, a field inspector with 12 years on the job, and asked if he could begin by examining the street valve. His manner was brisk but not unfriendly, the kind of professionalism that came from someone used to mediating between frustrated residents and the slow machinery of city infrastructure. Alice led him to the edge of her property, where the cast-iron cover lay in its patch of grass. He lifted it with a specialized tool, crouched down, and shone a flashlight into the darkness below. Whoever did this, he said after a moment, knew exactly what they were doing. He pointed out a set of fresh tool marks on the inner housing of the valve, the edges still sharp from recent contact. More troubling was the presence of a small brass locking collar, threaded neatly onto the stem, its design intended to allow quick access for someone with the right key, while making it nearly impossible for anyone else to turn the mechanism. Marcus tapped the collar with his finger. "This isn't city issue. We don't use these on residential lines. That means someone installed it without authorization." Alice felt a mixture of vindication and unease. She had been right that the shutoff was deliberate, but the precision of it suggested a practiced hand, not an impulsive act. Marcus took several photographs, recorded measurements, and jotted notes with a speed that suggested this was not the first time he had seen something of the kind. "I've been running into more of these lately," he admitted, "usually in neighborhoods with very proactive councils. They say it's for maintenance control, but it's not legal, and it's definitely not in your case. Your property isn't under any special water restrictions." He replaced the cover but did not remove the collar, explaining that he needed to log it with his department before taking further action. "If I pull it now without clearance, they can claim I tampered with their equipment, even though it's on your service line," he said. "Give me 2 days to get this pushed through. In the meantime, don't try to open it yourself. If they're watching, it could escalate things." Her pulse quickened at the thought of being watched, but the warning felt less like paranoia than practical advice. The events of the past days had already shown her that whoever was orchestrating this was not relying on chance. As Marcus drove away, she spotted Karen standing on her porch several houses down, phone in hand, her expression unreadable. Their eyes met for the briefest moment before Karen turned away, disappearing into the shadowed coolness of her open doorway. That afternoon, Alice received an unexpected call from Paul Anders. His voice was strained, and there was an urgency in the way he spoke that she had not heard before. "I need to tell you something, but you didn't hear it from me," he began, pausing as if to weigh the risk of continuing. He explained that 2 days before the shutoff, he had been approached at his workshop by a man he didn't recognize. Mid-40s, clean-cut, carrying a leather portfolio. The man claimed to represent the neighborhood council and presented what appeared to be an official work order authorizing the shutoff, complete with a forged city seal. The payment was in cash, more than double Paul's standard rate, with the clear implication that no invoice should be issued. "I went along with it because the paperwork looked legitimate," Paul said, "but after seeing Marcus's photos of that collar, I'm starting to think I was part of something I shouldn't have touched." Alice listened in silence, her mind threading the details together. A forged order, a cash payment, a specialized locking device, none of it was the work of an amateur. This was a coordinated effort, and while Karen's involvement seemed obvious, the man with the portfolio suggested another layer, someone comfortable enough with official systems to mimic them convincingly. Paul ended the call with a grim piece of advice. "Watch your step. If they went this far over a water line, they're not going to back off just because you filed a report." The next day brought a subtle but undeniable escalation. Returning from a brief errand, Alice noticed a small rectangular sticker affixed to her front gate, a bright red warning label typically used by code enforcement officers, stating that the property was under review for compliance violations. No one had knocked, and the label bore no signature or case number. When she called the city's code enforcement office, they confirmed there was no record of any open file on her address. The fake label was clearly meant to create the appearance of official trouble, a psychological nudge designed to unsettle her and perhaps to influence neighbors' perceptions. That evening, as she carried a bucket of stored rainwater to the garden, she caught sight of a car idling slowly at the end of her street. Its windows were tinted, the license plate partially obscured by dust, and though it eventually rolled away, the presence lingered in her thoughts long after it had gone. She began to understand that this was no longer just about the inconvenience of living without running water. It was about the slow tightening of a net around her, each small act designed to limit her options until compliance seemed easier than resistance. Yet the conversation with Marcus and the call from Paul had given her something the council had not anticipated, a foothold in the form of corroborated evidence. She began compiling a timeline of events, not as an amateur investigator but as a homeowner preparing to defend herself with the support of official channels. She kept copies of every notice, every photograph, every scrap of correspondence, knowing that in a conflict built on manipulation, the truth had to be preserved in forms that could not be quietly erased. By the end of the week, Marcus called to tell her that the authorization had gone through. He would return in the morning to remove the collar, reopen the valve, and install a city-issued seal that only municipal crews could lawfully access. His tone was matter-of-fact, but she detected a faint edge of caution. "Just be aware," he said, "that once it's back on, you might see other kinds of pressure. People who go to this much trouble don't take public exposure lightly." Alice thanked him, her voice steady despite the churn of anticipation beneath. She had no illusions that restoring her water would end the matter, but she knew that allowing the shutoff to stand would only invite more interference. The next phase would not be about water at all. It would be about drawing the line and holding it, no matter how many hands tried to push it back. Marcus arrived the next morning just after 8, the pale light of early day cutting through the faint haze that hung over the street. Alice watched from the front steps as he parked the utility truck and retrieved his tools, his movements precise and economical. Without unnecessary conversation, he lifted the cast-iron cover, crouched beside the valve, and worked methodically to remove the unauthorized locking collar. The device was heavier than she expected when he handed it to her in a sealed evidence bag, the brass gleaming dully where the wrench had scraped its surface. "This goes straight to our enforcement office," he said, locking the bag with a tamper-proof seal. "If they want to challenge this, they'll have to explain where it came from." With the collar gone, he turned the valve and she could hear, faint but unmistakable, the rush of water returning to the pipes beneath the lawn. Marcus installed a city-issued seal over the mechanism, snapping it into place with a solid click. "This is registered," he explained. "Any interference will leave obvious damage and only our crews can legally remove it. That's your safeguard, at least for the water supply." For the first time in days, the taps in her kitchen and bathroom flowed with clear, cold water. She stood for a long moment by the sink, the sound of it filling the room like something she had taken for granted until it was gone. Yet, even in that relief, she could feel the truth of Marcus's warning. The people who had engineered the shutoff would not see this as the end of the matter. If anything, having their method undone through official channels would make them more determined to reassert control. By early afternoon, the first sign of that determination arrived. A neatly folded flyer appeared in her mailbox, printed on thick cream paper with the council's insignia embossed at the top. It announced a mandatory community compliance review, scheduled for the following week, stating that her property had been selected for a full inspection of structural, aesthetic, and safety standards. There was no list of specific concerns, no explanation of how the selection process worked, and no mention of other properties being reviewed. She recognized it instantly for what it was, a pretext for intrusion. The wording was careful enough to sound official, but vague enough to allow nearly any finding they might wish to manufacture. That evening, while bringing in the mail, she saw Karen standing by her own fence, speaking in low tones to two men she did not recognize. One was tall and broad-shouldered, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of a windbreaker, while the other kept glancing toward Alice's house with a measured, impersonal interest. Their conversation stopped abruptly when they noticed her, replaced by the brittle smile Karen always seemed to have ready. "We'll talk later," Karen murmured to them before calling across the street. "I hope you'll be ready for your inspection, Alice. It would be such a shame if they found anything that required correction." The next morning, a more tangible warning made its appearance. A strip of her back fence had been knocked loose, the boards splintered as though struck with deliberate force. Inside the yard, one of her rain barrels lay on its side, the stored water spilled across the garden path. She inspected the area carefully and found no signs of animal interference. The break was too clean, the boards too intentionally displaced. She documented the damage with photographs and filed another report with the city, but she knew that in the absence of witnesses it would be noted and filed away with little immediate consequence. 2 days later, as she was leaving for a meeting at her accounting firm, a white pickup truck rolled to a slow stop beside her driveway. The driver, a man in his 50s with sun-creased skin and a baseball cap pulled low, leaned out the window and told her he was there, on behalf of the Compliance Review Committee, to conduct a preliminary exterior assessment. His tone carried the casual authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. When she asked for identification, he produced a laminated card that looked convincing at first glance but listed no municipal department, only a vague title and the council's name. She refused him entry, and his smile faded into something colder. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way, ma'am," he said before driving off, the truck's tires scattering grit against the curb. That evening, she received a voicemail from an unfamiliar number. The message was short, delivered in a voice distorted enough to obscure identity. "Stop fighting this. Pay the program fee and there will be no more problems." The click at the end of the message was as sharp as the chill that ran through her. She saved the recording, backing it up to 2 separate devices before forwarding it to the municipal investigator who had been assigned to her water case. In the days that followed, the pressure became more diffuse but constant. 2 council-issued citations for minor infractions appeared taped to her front door, one for non-conforming mailbox design and another for overgrown vegetation, despite her lawn being neatly trimmed. A neighbor she barely knew stopped her on the sidewalk to ask, in a tone thick with rehearsed concern, whether she was in some kind of trouble, explaining that there were rumors her property might be subject to liens. Alice recognized the tactic: create the appearance of instability, spread uncertainty through the community, and let social pressure do as much damage as the official channels. Yet each step they took seemed only to reinforce her resolve. She compiled everything, the flyer, the photographs, the citations, the voicemail, into an organized dossier, which she delivered in person to the city attorney's office. The receptionist assured her it would be reviewed, but Alice knew the real value was in building a record too substantial to ignore. The more they pushed, the more she ensured there was a clear trail connecting each act back to its source. When she returned home that evening, the street was quiet, the late summer light casting long shadows over the neat rows of houses. Yet, as she unlocked her front door, she felt the weight of eyes on her. Across the way, Karen stood again on her porch, hands resting lightly on the rail, her expression calm and unreadable. For a moment, neither woman moved. Then Karen's lips curved into a small knowing smile before she turned and disappeared inside, leaving Alice with the unshakable certainty that the next move was already being planned. The tipping point came on a Wednesday evening, just as the heat of the day was beginning to fade and the cicadas started their steady hum in the trees. Alice had returned from work to find a city-issued pickup truck already parked at the curb. Marcus was there, but his expression was more guarded than usual, his jaw set as he stepped toward her. "We need to talk inside," he said quietly, glancing over his shoulder toward the street. Once the door was closed behind them, he explained that the city attorney had decided to move forward with a formal investigation into the unauthorized shutoff and the forged work order, and that her case had been linked to 2 others in nearby neighborhoods. Both involved suspicious interference with water service. Both traced back to the same council-approved maintenance requests. The difference, Marcus said, was that in her case there was a physical device and multiple corroborating witnesses, enough to justify a search warrant for council records. Before she could respond, there was a sharp knock at the door. She and Marcus exchanged a glance before she opened it to find Karen standing there, immaculate as ever, holding a clipboard. "Alice," she said smoothly, "I have one last offer for you before this gets unpleasant. Pay the maintenance fee and I'll make sure all this goes away. No more inspections, no more citations, no more problems." The way she said the last word left no doubt as to what she meant. Alice stepped aside just enough for Marcus to be visible, his city insignia clear in the lamplight. Karen's eyes flicked to him, and for the first time Alice saw something fracture in her neighbor's composure. "You can't be here during council business," Karen said sharply. Marcus didn't raise his voice, but the authority in it was unmistakable. "This isn't council business. This is a municipal investigation, and you're now officially on record." Karen hesitated, then pressed the clipboard into Alice's hands before turning and walking briskly toward the sidewalk. But as she reached the curb, two unmarked sedans pulled in from opposite directions, their lights flashing briefly before shutting off. Two plainclothes officers stepped out, identifying themselves and presenting a folded document that Marcus confirmed was the warrant. Karen's attempt at indignation faltered under the weight of their formality, and within minutes they were escorting her back toward her own property to begin collecting any records, devices, or correspondence related to the maintenance program. Marcus stayed with Alice while the search was conducted, explaining that the forged work orders had been traced to a small printing shop owned by a man with direct ties to the council's treasurer. Payments had been funneled through a series of petty cash withdrawals, making them appear as minor operational expenses. What made her case unique, and dangerous for those involved, was Paul's statement, the physical locking collar, and the voicemail threat, all of which provided a direct line between the council's actions and the deliberate interference with city infrastructure. As the evening deepened, the sounds of officers moving through Karen's property reached them, the scrape of boxes being opened, the murmur of questions, the occasional metallic click of evidence bags being sealed. A uniformed officer eventually crossed the street to inform Marcus that they had recovered not only blank work order forms, but also a ledger, detailing special service interventions, several of which corresponded exactly with dates Alice had documented in her dossier. The ledger also contained initials beside each entry, one of which matched the treasurer's and another, without ambiguity, matched Karen's. When Karen was finally led down her walkway, her posture was stiff, her jaw tight, but the perfection of her appearance was marred by the small smudge of ink on her hand, a remnant from the paperwork she had clearly been reviewing before the warrant arrived. She did not look at Alice as she was placed into the back of one of the sedans, but Alice could feel the weight of the moment settling in. This was no longer a neighborhood feud, no longer a petty battle over compliance. It was a matter of criminal accountability, and the consequences would now move beyond the boundaries of Ashford Lane. Marcus left soon after, but not before advising her to remain alert. "There may be others who aren't ready to see this end," he said, his gaze steady. "You've just pulled the thread on something bigger than your water line." As his truck pulled away, the street felt unusually still, as though the houses themselves were holding their breath. Alice stood for a long time in the quiet, the air cool against her skin, aware that while the confrontation had reached its peak, the final outcome was still to come. In the days following the search and Karen's removal from the neighborhood council, Ashford Lane seemed to move with a cautious quiet. The usual rhythm of sprinklers ticking in the morning and neighbors chatting over hedges returned, but there was an unspoken awareness that something had shifted. A few residents avoided Alice altogether, perhaps wary of being associated with the conflict, while others offered brief, almost reluctant acknowledgments, as if admitting they had watched the events unfold from behind curtains. The municipal investigation widened, eventually confirming that the so-called maintenance program had been a coordinated scheme to extract cash payments under the pretense of infrastructure upkeep, targeting homeowners who resisted other forms of pressure. For Alice, the tangible change came when the city installed a reinforced service box for her water connection, secured with a registered municipal lock and fitted with a tamper sensor that would alert the department if disturbed. Marcus visited one last time to walk her through the system, his tone lighter now, as though satisfied that the immediate threat had been neutralized. Paul returned a week later to check her plumbing at no charge, a quiet gesture that said more than an apology could. Karen's house remained occupied, but by the time she returned from her initial hearings, her influence had evaporated. The fence where she had once leaned to survey the street was now bare, her interactions with neighbors clipped and minimal. The council appointed an interim representative, and the talk at the occasional community gathering shifted to mundane matters: landscaping schedules, streetlight repairs, leaving no room for the dominance Karen had once wielded. On a late summer evening, Alice stood at the edge of her garden, the roses recovering from weeks of careful attention, the sound of water flowing from the hose steady and unthreatened. The events of the past month had etched themselves into her understanding of what it meant to defend one's home, not through anger alone, but through persistence, documentation, and the deliberate use of the right channels. She had not sought to become an example, yet in some small way she had, and the proof lay in the quiet stability of her restored routine. The air was still, the garden alive again, and for the first time in weeks she allowed herself to believe that the line she had drawn would hold.